All right, Mike, thank you. Well, President Trump is making some big claims about election interference.
As Jen Sullivan reports, he's leveled accusations about attempted foreign interference and alleged vulnerabilities of election infrastructure.
Good evening.
President Donald Trump delivering a primetime address Thursday, claiming there are, quote, shocking vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure.
Tonight, we're publishing a series of previously classified U.S. intelligence community assessments and other reports proving that our government has long known these machines are extremely exposed to attack.
Still, Trump has not provided evidence that machines have been exploited by a foreign adversary. He also accused China of meddling in the 2020 election, but Trump did not elaborate on how it may have impacted the results of the election.
China engaged in other election-related activities to undermine my first administration and our 2020 campaign.
Trump has repeatedly claimed the election was rigged and that he won in 2020 instead of former President Joe Biden. Those claims have repeatedly been proven false. The U.S. intelligence community released a report in 2021 that said China did not interfere, specifically saying China, quote, considered but did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. And the states who were accused of election fraud say every precaution is taken to ensure results are honest and authentic.
This is why we have paper ballots. It's why we do pre-election tests, and then we do post-election hand count audits to make sure that the machines read the ovals correctly.
Thursday's speech comes just months ahead of the critical midterm elections, where Republicans could lose the majority in either the Senate, the House, or both.
The Department of Homeland Security is expected to hold a press briefing today on efforts to secure U.S. elections. As we mentioned earlier, at least one of the documents mentions that Nevada is another state where a Homeland Security investigation found non-citizens registered to vote. We've reached out to the governor's office for a response. Here's how the Nevada Secretary of State, Cisco Aguilar, responded, saying, quote, the facts have not changed. Nevada's elections are among the safest, most secure, and accessible in the nation. There are numerous protections in place to prevent non-citizens and anyone ineligible from casting a ballot. Any claims of election fraud are taken seriously and investigated by our office, but there is no evidence of widespread fraud. Attempts to spread misinformation and create distrust make people question a process that works and threaten to stop them from participating and voting. When voters lose confidence in elections, our entire democracy suffers.